the United Arab Emirates is running out of natural water, and at the very same time, all summer long, it runs its air conditioning at maximum power, around the clock, without pause. Set those two facts side by side, and they look, at first glance, like a glaring contradiction, even a kind of hypocrisy. A nation draining the last of its natural water while simultaneously pouring colossal quantities of energy into keeping itself cool. It seems like the very picture of a country living beyond its means, indulging in luxury while its foundations crumble. But the truth, as it so often is stranger and far more revealing than simple irony, because these two facts are not opposites at all. They are not a contradiction. They are, in actual reality, two faces of one single crisis, bound tightly together by one common thread, energy, and converging every single summer upon the very same dangerous breaking point. This is the story of how, in the modern UAE, the making of water and the making of cold became one tightly wound problem, and of why the nation's two great lifelines pull hardest at exactly the same moment, in exactly the same brutal season, hanging together by exactly the same fragile thread. Let us take the two halves of this paradox one at a time and start with the water. Because the claim that the UAE is running out of it deserves to be stated precisely. It is true, and it is not an exaggeration. The country has no rivers and no natural lakes, and its rainfall amounts to barely 100 millimeters in a year. Its only genuinely natural source of fresh water is the groundwater held in aquifers beneath the desert. And that groundwater is being pumped out far faster than nature can ever replace it. In many areas, the water table is falling by more than a meter every single year, and by some sober estimates, the country could exhaust its natural fresh groundwater within roughly 50 years. So the natural water genuinely is running out. That part of the title is simply, literally true. But here is the crucial nuance that keeps the taps flowing as the natural water dwindles. The way replaces it by manufacturing water instead, through desalination, the industrial stripping of salt from seawater. So the country is not about to go dry tomorrow. What is happening is subtler and, in its own way, more telling. The way is steadily substituting an energy-hungry, manufactured water supply for the vanishing natural one. The natural water empties away, and an artificial, electrically powered water supply rises to take its place. This substitution is a quietly momentous thing, and it is worth appreciating what it really means. For the entire span of human history in this region until just a few decades ago, the amount of water available set a hard ceiling on how many people could live here and how they could live. The natural water was the fundamental constraint, and life organized itself within its limits. Desalination shattered that ceiling. By manufacturing fresh water from the effectively limitless sea, the way severed the ancient link between the natural water supply and the size of the population it could support. This is what allowed the country to grow from a sparse desert society into a nation of some 10 million people living in modern cities. But severing that link did not make the constraint vanish, it merely transformed it. The old, natural limit of available water was replaced by a new limit, the availability of energy to manufacture water. Where once the binding scarcity was water itself, now the binding scarcity is the power required to make it. The country traded a dependence on rainfall and aquifers, which it could not control, for a dependence on electricity generation, which it could, at least for now, control and expand. And in doing so, it quietly bound its water supply, forever, to its energy supply. Now to the second half of the paradox, the air conditioning, and here the scale of what is happening is genuinely staggering. In a country where the summer air temperature climbs into the mid-40s Celsius, and where the humidity can push the feels-like temperature towards 60, air conditioning is not a comfort or a luxury. It is, quite simply, the precondition for modern life to exist here at all. Without it, the offices could not function, the homes would be unbearable, and the cities as they exist would be impossible. And so air conditioning runs very nearly everywhere, all the time. Roughly 80% of households across the Gulf are already air-conditioned and in the punishing heat of summer. Those units run around the clock. The consequence is astonishing. Air conditioning accounts for something on the order of 70% of the WAE's electricity consumption during the peak of summer. Let that single figure land for a moment. 7 out of every 10 units of electricity the country generates at the very height of the season go toward the single, unglamorous task of holding back the heat. Summer electricity demand runs 2 to 3 times higher than in winter, and the overwhelming dominant driver of that enormous seasonal surge is the relentless, ceaseless work of cooling. In summer, the entire nation becomes, in effect, one enormous machine for manufacturing cold. It is worth dwelling on just how completely air conditioning has reshaped life and infrastructure here, because it goes far beyond personal comfort. The very architecture of the modern Gulf city assumes constant cooling. The glass towers, the enclosed malls, the covered walkways are all designed around the presumption that the air inside will be mechanically chilled at all times. Remove that assumption, and the buildings become uninhabitable ovens, sealed glass boxes baking in the sun. This means the cooling cannot be treated as optional or dialed back at will during a shortage. It is woven into the fundamental fabric of the built environment. A city in a mild climate can survive a day without air conditioning by simply opening the windows. A Gulf city in high summer largely cannot, because its buildings were never designed to be survivable without active cooling in the first place. The dependence is therefore not merely a matter of habit or preference, but of physical design, locked into concrete and steel and glass across entire metropolises. And that near total. Structurally embedded reliance is precisely what makes the 70% figure so consequential. It is not describing a discretionary indulgence that could be easily trimmed, but a load that is, for all practical purposes, mandatory for the cities to function at all. And now we arrive at the hidden link, the crucial insight that dissolves the apparent contradiction and reveals the two facts as fundamentally one. What do these two things, the making of water and the making of cold, actually have in common? They both run on precisely the same thing, enormous, relentless quantities of electricity. Desalination, the process now supplying an ever larger share of the country's water, is one of the most energy-intensive industrial processes that exists, consuming vast amounts of power to force seawater into freshness. Air conditioning, as we have just seen, devours the majority of the country's summer electricity. So the water supply and the cooling supply are not two separate systems that happen to coexist. They are the two single largest consumers of the very same resource, drawing on the very same power grid, competing for the very same generating capacity. This is not a coincidence or a curiosity. The International Energy Agency, studying the region, identifies these two forces, cooling and desalination, as the twin engines together driving the relentless growth of the region's electricity demand, projected to rise by half again over the coming decade. Water and cold, in the modern way, are ultimately at bottom the same energy problem, simply wearing two different masks. And here is where this shared foundation turns from an interesting observation into a genuine and mounting danger, because both of these colossal energy demands peak at exactly the same time. Think about when the country needs the most cooling. It is summer, when the heat is at its most extreme. And think about when the country needs the most water. It is also summer, when evaporation is fiercest, when demand for water is highest, when the strain on every system is greatest. So the two single largest draws on the nation's power supply do not take turns, they do not balance each other out across the seasons. Instead, they slam into the electrical grid simultaneously, both reaching their absolute maximum in the same blistering months, piling one enormous demand directly on top of the other. The nation's entire power system must therefore be built and sized to withstand this combined summer maximum, a towering peak of demand created by the collision of cooling and water at the single worst possible moment of the year. Two maximums colliding every summer on the same grid. There is a further, almost poetic cruelty in this timing that deserves to be spelled out. The heat that drives the cooling demand is the same heat that drives the water demand, so the two are not merely coincidentally aligned, but causally linked to the same underlying force. A hotter summer does not raise one demand and leave the other untouched. It raises both together, in lockstep, because both are ultimately responses to the temperature. This means the two demands are not just correlated, but tightly bound, rising and falling as one, amplifying each other rather than averaging out. In most energy systems around the world, different demands peak at different times, and this staggering of peaks is a blessing because it smooths out the total load and lets a smaller amount of generating capacity serve a larger set of needs. The way enjoys no such luck. Its two greatest demands are synchronized by the very climate itself, both cresting together on the hottest afternoons of the year, when the sun is highest and the air is most punishing. The power system cannot count on one demand ebbing to make room for the other. It must be built to supply both at their simultaneous maximum, an expensive and demanding requirement that shapes the entire scale of the nation's energy infrastructure. If that were the whole of it, it would be difficult enough. But the situation is worse still, because both of these systems become not just more demanded, but more inefficient precisely as the conditions grow more extreme. Consider the air conditioning first. The hotter the outside air becomes, the harder an air conditioner must work to move heat out of a building, and the less efficient it becomes at doing so. On the very hottest days, each unit of cooling costs more energy to deliver than it did on a milder day. Now consider the desalination. As the Gulf itself grows hotter, and as it grows saltier from the very brine that desalination pumps back into it, the seawater feeding the plants becomes more difficult to process. Warmer, saltier water fouls the delicate membranes of the plants more quickly, demanding more chemicals, more maintenance, and more energy for every liter of fresh water produced. So on the hottest days of the year, at the very moment when the demand for both cooling and water reaches its absolute peak, the energy cost of delivering each one is also climbing. The system is straining hardest at the exact instant it is operating least efficiently. A cruel compounding of pressures that pushes the whole apparatus toward its limits. This brings us to the sharpest and most sobering implication of the entire arrangement, the single point of failure that lies at its heart. Because both the water and the cooling ultimately depend on the same electricity, they share one common vulnerability, one thread from which both lifelines hang. In a temperate country, a summer power cut is an inconvenience. A few uncomfortable hours until the lights come back on. In the way, a sustained power failure in the depth of summer would be something else entirely. It would threaten both the water supply and the cooling at the very same time. In a single stroke, a population could find itself losing its only defense against 50-degree heat and its supply of fresh water simultaneously. In some of the most physically hostile conditions found anywhere on the surface of the earth, the two great securities of modern desert life, cold air and clean water, are not independent guarantees backing each other up. They are braided together into one single, fragile strand. And that is the true meaning hidden inside the paradox of the title. It is not that the way foolishly squanders energy on cooling while carelessly running out of water. It is that the way's water and the way's cooling are one and the same energy bet, a bet that reaches its most precarious point, that strains and stretches and hangs by a thread in the heart of every single summer. To grasp why this coupling is so much more dangerous than either problem alone, imagine the two as separate for a moment. A country that only needed to worry about water could stockpile it, store it in reservoirs and tanks against a bad day, ration it carefully if supplies ran short. A country that only needed to worry about cooling could, in the worst case, endure a period of discomfort until power was restored. But when the two are fused, the failure modes multiply and reinforce one another. Cold air, unlike water, cannot be stockpiled in any meaningful quantity. The moment the power stops, the cooling stops, and the interior temperature begins its relentless climb toward the lethal conditions outside. And in the very same instant, the pumps and plants that supply and treat the water fall silent too. So a single failure at the shared foundation, the electricity, cascades outward into both systems at once, and it does so in a climate where the margin for error is measured not in days, but in hours. This is what it means for two lifelines to share a single thread. Their fates are no longer independent, and the thing that severs one severs the other in the same motion, at the worst possible time. When the heat outside is at its most murderous, nor does the system merely strain, it actively feeds and worsens itself. in a spiral that should by now feel familiar. The overwhelming majority of the energy powering both the cooling and the desalination has historically come from burning fossil fuels, which release the greenhouse gases that warm the planet. And a warmer planet means hotter summers, which means still more air conditioning, and still more water demand, which means still more energy burned, which means still more warming. Layered on top of this, every air conditioner, by its very nature, does not destroy heat but merely moves it, pumping the heat from inside buildings out into the streets, intensifying the urban heat island and making the cities hotter than ever, which in turn demands yet more cooling. The two-headed energy monster of water and cold, in other words, does not sit still. It grows, year by year, feeding on the very heat it helps to create, an engine that accelerates itself so that each summer arrives a little hotter, a little thirstier, and a little hungrier for power than the one before it. In fairness, the Way is acutely aware of all of this, and is working hard to tame the beast, and its efforts are genuine and substantial. Perhaps the single most promising move is the turn towards solar power, which carries a beautiful logic in this context. The sun blazes most fiercely at exactly the moment cooling demand is highest. So solar generation naturally peaks in step with the summer peak it is needed to meet. The country is building enormous solar capacity to power both its grid and, increasingly, its desalination. It is investing in more efficient, membrane-based desalination technologies that consume less energy than the older methods. It is pursuing efficiency in cooling, which matters enormously. Because the air conditioners across the Gulf currently run at less than half the efficiency of the best units elsewhere in the world, by one striking estimate, simply improving their efficiency could cut the growth in peak power demand by an amount equivalent to the entire electrical capacity of a whole country. It is expanding centralized district cooling, which is far more efficient than countless individual units, and it is managing demand directly through peak hour pricing and public campaigns urging residents to raise their thermostats a degree or two, since each degree can meaningfully cut consumption. These are serious, intelligent measures aimed squarely at decoupling this whole system from fossil fuels and taming the ferocious summer peak. So let us arrive at the honest and complete assessment. Is the Way running out of natural water while running its air conditioning at maximum power around the clock? The answer to both halves is yes. But the honest, and far more interesting, truth is that these are not two separate facts, and certainly not a hypocrisy. They are one single, tightly coupled reality. The natural water genuinely is depleting and is being replaced at growing energy cost by water manufactured from the sea. The air conditioning genuinely does run almost without pause, consuming the majority of the nation's summer power. And these two things are lashed together by energy into a single system that peaks together, strains together, grows more inefficient together, and hangs together upon one grid, all at exactly the same brutal moment each and every year. The system works, and it works impressively. The taps run and the air stays cool across a scorching desert that should, by every natural measure, be nearly uninhabitable. But it is a system running ever closer to its own limits, defended only by the ceaseless flow of energy and the constant, expensive vigilance required to keep that energy flowing. The apparent contradiction of the title dissolves, on inspection, into a deeper and more sobering truth. The Way has built its entire survival on manufacturing both its water and its cold out of energy, and in a steadily warming world, both that energy bill and that summer collision can only grow larger with time. There is, as ever, a significance here that reaches far beyond the borders of one desert nation. The International Energy Agency has warned that cooling and desalination together are set to drive an enormous share of the growth in electricity demand across the entire region and increasingly across the wider world in the decades ahead. As the planet warms and dries, more and more places will find themselves needing both more cooling to survive the heat and more manufactured water to survive the drought, and they will discover, just as the Way has, that these two needs are joined at the hip, both feeding on the same electricity, both peaking in the same season, both straining the same grid. The Way is simply the frontier, the place confronting this energy-water cooling collision first and most intensely. How it manages that collision, through solar power, through efficiency, through smarter design, or how it fails to, will be studied closely, because it is a preview of a challenge that a hotter, thirstier world is going to face on an ever-widening scale. So in the end, the two facts in the title are not a contradiction to be scolded, but a confession to be understood. They reveal that in this desert, water and coolness are no longer things a person simply finds in the world. They are things that must be manufactured, and manufactured, both of them, out of the very same precious current of electricity. The way is not running out of water while wastefully squandering power on cold. It is expending staggering amounts of power to make both its water and its cold, and it is doing so most intensely at the precise moment, the peak of summer, when the heat renders each of them simultaneously the most expensive to produce and the most essential to have. The taps still flow and the air stays cool, and that remains a genuine marvel of human engineering against a merciless environment. But behind that everyday marvel hums a single, vast, and ever-expanding machine, tirelessly converting energy into survival itself and pulling hardest at exactly the moment the desert bears down with the greatest force. And the day that machine ever falters, in the dead heat of an unforgiving summer, would be the day the UAE finally discovers that its water and its comfort were never two separate securities to be weighed against each other at all, but one single security, braided from one thread, and only ever as safe as the power that made them both.